Here we go, ladies and gentlemen.
They've been preparing for weeks now for this.
The verdict has been reached in the trial of Derek Chauvin at the death of George Floyd. After 10.5 hours of jury deliberation,
most of the businesses are
we're going to come get the verdict right now.
Want to take any chances.
So let's
remember
roll.
those protests, those violent protests that happened here last summer, and people are afraid. They want to be ready for any sort of verdict to come. Now, David, we also want to talk about the jury. You know, we've been focusing on every single thing that they've done, and this is a group of jurors that has been taking notes every day during this trial. It was noted that they were attentive, that they were seemed inquisitive and paying attention to the experts who testified. And, you know, it's really hard to read the tea leaves in a situation like this, but one of the things that I noted yesterday, just in covering trials, yesterday the jury started deliberating very late, and they stayed an extra hour. Even after a long day, they stayed an extra hour. And this morning, they started deliberating about 90 minutes early. And to me, that seemed to indicate that perhaps they were close to reaching something and wanted to work on it.
10.5 hours, 11 hours to deliberate.
Some sort of decision.
I would have been done pretty quick.
And as we await that decision, David, I think about my conversation with Terrence Floyd, George Floyd's brother. And I remember he was in so much pain right after this incident happened. And one of the things he said to me was that seeing this case through, all the way through a conviction, was something that his family wanted for and would continue to fight for until they saw it. So they could have an answer to that very soon, David.
Alex Perez in Minneapolis. Alex, thank you. That was a live picture there of Minneapolis, South Minneapolis, not far from the scene of where this all began to unfold. About a year ago, Memorial Day last year, of course, the corner of Chicago and 38th Street there in front of the Cup Foods in South Minneapolis, George Floyd Square, as it's now called. I want to bring in Lindsay Davis because, Lindsay, you and I have talked so much about this case. We've been on the air together all along the way.
Well, I was going to show.
It's so rare that this country takes a sort of deep breath together to watch one of these moments come in. But this is one of those moments, given the reckoning, the conversation in this country. And I think that we were all struck a year ago, and then the continuing protests and conversations over the course of the year, the diversity in the faces of the people out in the streets, small towns, large cities. A couple weeks after that, after George Floyd, Breonna Taylor was killed. To the Floyd family as well, to see the diversity of the people supporting them and this conversation about policing and justice in America.
They're saying justice for like that.
That's right. So many collectively holding their breath here, David. You can perhaps hear the helicopters above. I know that we just saw the crowds outside of Cup Foods at 38th in Chicago, but just to kind of scene set for you here, just a few blocks away from the courthouse in downtown Minneapolis, it's eerily quiet. You know, there are a few cars, but very few people out on the road. I went for a walk today just to kind of get a temperature and feel of the people. Happened to just come in contact with one man. He happened to be a black man. I said, so what do we think? And he said, I think if they come back quick, we got him. And he had a personal pride. He was invested, some skin in the game. He kind of felt that he was taking this on, certainly personally, with regard to whatever the verdict would be.
I don't think 10.5 hours would be considered quick.
Well. I mean, there's people from all walks of life. You have 3 who are in their 20s, ranging in age. You have 1 woman who goes into her 60s, and 6 who identify as people of color, 3 of them black men. You have one who's a social worker, accountant, a chemist, a banker, a nurse. And we did get a lot of color during the jury selection about their thoughts on race and social justice and criminal justice. There was a white man who was very clear. He said, look, I believe all lives matter. You had a black man who said that when he had seen the video, he had told his wife that could have been me. And so going into this, they allowed these jurors that had these diverse opinions and backgrounds and experiences and perspectives.
And that's good thinking. That man's smart man. He sees, you know, it could be anybody. Not could be just a black man. It could be an Asian guy. It could be a Latino guy. It could be a white man.
Right, which the defense obviously wanted them to be sequestered and not hear that, but the judge allowed them to hear that, and so you have to wonder, were they at all impacted by that? And were they able to just focus on this as an isolated incident, or did they look at the historical injustice of all of this? Additionally, they knew about the $27 million settlement. This was the largest pretrial settlement in America's history for this kind of a civil rights death. And so a lot going into what those jurors brought into this and what they thought as it all played out in real time.
We can hear the choppers overhead there in Minneapolis. Our thanks to
Plus
Lindsay
you gotta
Davis.
keep in mind,
checking back in with you over the course of
we
this
just got
afternoon.
recently
These are
with the
live
death
pictures
of
on the ground
two
there
more
in
people
South
in the hands
Minneapolis.
of cops, you know. You got the Dante
Relative calm, as you
Wright
can
and
see in this
Annie
community,
Toledo.
and so many communities across this country. I think people in their smartphones have heard that there is a verdict. The judge revealing that.
See, look at that.
The verdict
See?
will be delivered in about an hour.
This is
That
George
was
Floyd's
a little
right
more than
now.
an hour ago, so we are expecting that jury at any time. And Lindsay talking about the diversity of the members of that jury. And I know we have that graphic that actually breaks down members of the jury, if we have a moment to bring that back up, just to help folks at home understand that the jury selection was something that both sides so carefully spent time on in this case. Members of the jury, 5 men,
Yeah, here we go.
7 women, ages from
The trio.
20 to
5 men,
60
7
years
women,
old.
26 years
4
old, 4 black,
jurors,
6
white
white, 2
jurors, and 2
multi-racial.
jurors
That's
who
what I'm talking about.
self-identify as multiracial. One of the jurors, for example, a white woman in her 50s, she works as a nurse. She assured the court that even though she had seen a portion of that viral video, that the video of George Floyd on the ground, that she could be impartial. And she acknowledged that we all bring life experience to the jury if we are selected, and talked about how her background as a nurse could potentially help her make decisions in this case.
Well, keep in mind, remember you had a paramedic on the trial that she was denied.
Along with us from the very beginning. And Byron, I mentioned this a moment ago in talking with Lindsay, the diversity of the faces of the families across this country who wanted justice after seeing that video themselves. And this has really been almost a year-long conversation in this country about how we move forward.
You're so right, David. And that's why this moment is so different from other moments in American history. We've seen instances where Black America went in one direction and white America seemed to go someplace else. In this particular moment, this case, the reaction seemed to be universal. People of all stripes reacted in a very passionate way to the death of George Floyd. And David, I'm struck by something that you said earlier, that this is a deep breath moment for our nation. I think you're absolutely right. You think about these kinds of trials. I was looking at that trial, the 4 police officers in Los Angeles in 1992, the O.J. Simpson trial in 1995. This day is one of those moments.
The Rodney King.
Where many Americans
some people say that's how cop watching
began. See what happens. And David, I think in many ways we may have 2 verdicts today. We will have the verdict of this jury, this diverse jury.
Just over 2 years ago, we had the trial of Roy Oliver. Then last year was Amber Geiger.
One can imagine that, however it goes, a portion of America will see that justice was served. A portion of America will say that justice missed its mark. And I think while we wait for this verdict, it'll also be curious to see, and I think that's why we see the law enforcement presence in Minneapolis and other major cities across this nation, as we all, David, as you said, hold our breath waiting for this verdict.
And of course, Byron, no one wants to get ahead of themselves as far as this verdict is concerned. We do know that the relatively short amount of time and the weight of this case, as we heard from Sonny Hostin earlier, signals that there was agreement, and fairly early on within that jury. That jury that was sequestered immediately after those closing arguments, immediately after getting instructions from the judge who asked them not to bring their bias into that decision-making, but also not to worry or be concerned with how the country and the world would react to their decision, because after all, the live stream showed the rest of us what transpired in that courtroom, with the exception of the jurors themselves. We all got to watch, but we didn't see the folks who will actually make this decision, who were there from day one during this trial. I want to bring in Terry Austin from Law and Crime, the network that covers this. She's been covering this case, obviously, for the better part of a year. And Terry, I wanted to remind people at home, as we await this decision from the jury, what the prosecution was up against here. They had to convince beyond reasonable doubt that Derek Chauvin's actions, his knee to the neck, was a substantial cause of George Floyd's death. Not the only cause, but a substantial one.
That's exactly right. And I think the jury did boil it down to 2 issues. That issue that you just mentioned, the fact that there was unreasonable use of force, and that the substantial cause of the death was that unreasonable use of force. So they narrowed it down, and I think they came to a quick decision based on all of the evidence. And we had multiple witnesses who talked about this use of force. And of course, we had Chief Arredondo, who was pivotal in stating not only was this unreasonable use of force, but this was against policy and it was not showing the duty of care. The other issue that clearly the jury came to a very swift conclusion was the fact that the cause of death was the knee and it was unreasonable. And so they listened to all the medical evidence. They listened to all of the evidence from the police officers. They cut to the chase. I'm sure they did consider the different elements that the judge talked about as far as the second degree, third degree, and manslaughter. But I think they narrowed it down to what Jerry Blackwell said on his rebuttal, which was this: use the 46th witness on the stand, which is your common sense. If you believe that, in fact, what you saw on this video was unreasonable force and that the knee on the back and the neck caused the death, then you have to come back with the guilty verdict. And I do believe that's exactly what they did.
Well, we'll wait and see for that, because we also know that the defense spent 3 hours yesterday in its closing argument from defense attorney Eric Nelson to try to sow doubt among that jury, continuing with what he had done over the course of the trial, bringing up past drug use of George Floyd, his heart condition, asking was there the potential of any carbon monoxide from that patrol car? Did bystanders distract Derek Chauvin while he was right there at that scene with his knee to George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes, 29 seconds? And the defense attorney tried to make the case that this particular trial is about more than those 9 minutes, that the jurors, when they deliberate, should be thinking about, as he said, the 60 minutes that came before and what Chauvin came upon when he arrived at that scene. He tried to use images of them putting George Floyd into the patrol car, 3 officers trying to do that to no avail, to try to make the case that those were all factors that Derek Chauvin took into account in those 9 minutes. Of course, then the rebuttal from the prosecution, making the point that over the course of those 9 minutes, he certainly had time to react to what he was presiding over during those 9 minutes, and a direct reaction to the carbon monoxide suggestion, saying if that were in fact the case, that the carbon monoxide was coming from the police patrol car, so he should have been aware of that too. So we saw a back and forth between the prosecution and the defense as they made their closing arguments yesterday. I want to bring in Kenneth Moten from Minneapolis. Kenneth was on the air with us yesterday as we were covering these closing arguments. I know that you have been in touch with George Floyd's family and his family's representation, Ben Crump and others, for their reaction to the prosecution's closing argument, and then the defense once we heard the 3 hours of their closing argument. And I'm curious if you're hearing anything in the last 24 hours and to the development of this last hour.
David, they are gathered in a hotel here in downtown Minneapolis. The words we're hearing right now at this hour, they're optimistic. They are in good spirits, but they're also anxious, eager, nervous as we await this verdict here. Also, we know that when it comes to this Floyd family, that in the past 10, 11 months or so, since the death of George Floyd, this family has gone through a lot. Yes, they got a $27 million settlement, but they lost this loved one, this person they knew, who they watched in this video die at the knee of Derek Chauvin. And so for this family, they've gotten the good and the bad, David. They have gotten a lot of support, but they've also heard from the critics who believe that George Floyd shouldn't have resisted, that he was on drugs, that he was somehow at fault. But they've got a number of supporters, people who have been in these streets. And so Flonus Floyd, the brother of George Floyd, has said that he is urging for peace and calm after this verdict is read, but he knows that he can't control the anger on these streets for those people who are hitting the streets. And really, David, for this family, for months now, they have watched this country go through a racial reckoning. They've watched this country change, and many industries change because of this racial reckoning. But they truly feel that today, with this verdict, that today is their day of reckoning. David?
Kenneth Moten in Minneapolis, and the family all along has asked for peace and calm across this country, something Terrence Floyd told me almost a year ago in Brooklyn, that they were deeply moved by the diversity of the faces in these protests across the country, but saying any sort of violence is not what their brother would have wanted. I want to bring in our senior national correspondent, Steve Osunsami, of course, following the case as well. And Steve, as you and I were on the air yesterday during these closing arguments, we heard the prosecution say this is not an anti-police prosecution, that this is the case of Derek Chauvin, one lone officer in this particular trial. We know other officers will come later, perhaps later this summer, but this case is about Derek Chauvin, they said. And what was fascinating in this trial, and somewhat rare, as you know, Steve, is that sort of blue wall came down. There were a number of police witnesses that they used to make this case, and they put up a